Hi and welcome everybody to our 33rd How to Repair Pendulum Clocks Open Clock Club. And as you will know, if you've been following our notifications, then this week we're at least going to make a start on this badger. We're going to look at the anatomy of a fusee driven clock. However, we have to eat our broccoli, our greens, before our Battenberg cake or our Arctic roll. So not quite ready to start with because we've still got a job to finish from last week. So I'll just pop that to one side and get our, no, got another job to do first. So big thank you to everybody who's been following along on Facebook this week. It's been, that group is really going good. Going good. Whatever, anyway. At the moment, some brilliant contributors. Thank you for sharing your work in progress. So really appreciated. One of the things that we were doing in the week was our live stream, of course, on Thursday. Thank you again for those people who came along to that. And if you didn't manage to get there, you can find it on our channel. And the last thank you, of course, is to everybody, those people who bought our book this week, Help Keeps the Lights On, and of course, the e-publication on bushing or depthing and bushing, because those two things, as we all know, are inextricable. So no bushing without depthing, please. Very quick thing to get us started, and that is, you might have seen the video we made about fitting file handles on Thursday at the live stream. I was using this, you know, it's just like a regular kind of DIY shop file, but I was using it without a handle, which is a big no-no. So just going to very quickly fit a handle on there, because I know you all like a bit of gas, bit of a flame. So here's my handle, and it's been soaking for about an hour or something. Drilled a little hole in the side to let all the steam and smoke out. You will have seen the technique of burning handles on. Well, this technique, which I think I developed, or maybe not, maybe stole it from somebody, is better than that, because the problem with burning handles on is that when you put the handle in the file tang in the handle, it continues to burn and it can actually burn itself loose. So if the handle is soaked first, the wood is kind of compliant to start with. And also when it dries out, it shrinks onto the tang, making it a particularly good fit. So we're just going to whack that on first, get my safety goggles on, get my glasses on. It won't take long, just while everybody gets signed up. Oh, I forgot to say, remember, please, these sessions are recorded and they go on our channel. So if you want to remain anonymous, then please keep your camera turned off. As always, we've got Team Open Clock Club across here in the corner sorting out the live chat. So massive thank you to Team Open Clock Club. And please say hello and ask any questions. We will try and answer the questions. So it's going to heat the tang of the file to red, and then we're going to whack the file on. I've got my water standing by here, and I'm going to put the thing in the water to cool it down when I've done. Already got quite a lot of stuff on the bench. So you can see the temper colors on the tang of the file now. Once about 10 millimeters begins to glow red, we can put it in. a lot of lights on in here, but it's about getting there. Let's give it another 30 seconds. Move this because I don't want to break it. There we are. Straight in the water. Job done. Fire alarm going to go off any second. So all good fun. So there we are. That's my patented way to fit file handles. No excuse not having file handles on your files or file handles drop off. Okay, cool. Great, got that out of the way. Just before I move on to our project, it's all going to be a bit manic today. I thought normally I make an excuse and apologies for it being crazy. This week I thought, let's just go for it. You know, what the heck? So much to get through. So remember this. This is our French clock bezel with a broken elbow or corner knuckle joint on the strap. You can see how these things are made. They're folded over again, and then drilled and tapped. And they're not deburred. They leave the thread long, which is really useful, of course, because it increases surface area. So we had a really cool thing on Facebook, which was a kind of vote for different ways. And the outcome of that was really cool because there's all sorts of different ways that I'd never really thought of how we could do this. So I made this thing, drilled a hole in it. I made a real schoolboy error here in drilling this hole because I looked at this thread on this side. Maybe now we won't start talking about threads from scratch because we'll never get onto our Fusey clock. But there is just like a lifetime study in threads. And much to my great joy, what I found was that this thread, the existing thread, which I think is the original thread, is pretty much near as damn it 1/8 inch Whitworth, which was really cool. So very pleased with that. Just happens to be a coincidence, unless this has been retapped, of course, and it might have been, but I kind of doubt it. Anyway, so I decided to do this one 1/8 inch Whitworth. Obviously, that makes our life really easy because you can just buy screws and things without having to make something bespoke. Now, somewhere here, yeah, there we are. I've got a bit of wood, which was useful because the first thing I did was, in order to measure this, we've been through this on the live stream, but in order to measure this thread, what I did was I got a bit of pegwood, comme ça, and pencil. Put a bit of graphite in the hole, and then thread in your bit of wood like that. And then you can get a pretty good idea of the major diameter of the thread and the pitch. And they're really the two values that we're interested in. And it just happens to be that this pitch is nearly, you know, as close to 1/8 inch Whitworth as you might like, which is, it's one of those taps with it laser engraved on it, and of course I can't read it. So that's a really useful tip for determining the pitch of old threads. So I'm just going to tap that little bit of brass. But what I did was I just kind of grabbed a drill, random drill, to make the pilot hole, and I've drilled it a bit big. But let's not worry about that too much. These things happen. So here's our tap wrench, sorry. Yeah, there's a good question about, crops up every so often about standardization of threads in clocks. And really a lot of the stuff that we work on, you know, the stuff that's pre-1850, really there's nothing beyond the kind of local standardization. So if you're going to repair clocks, inevitably you will find something that has got either a screw missing or you've got a screw and you need to make a hole to match. And it's, in my view, very good practice, just looking around for my device, which we've lost, a really good practice not to tap out to the nearest sort of modern size. So just bear with me a second while I find so many potential, there we are, made in John's Vice. So just going to very quickly tap this. Not massively worried about it being super square. Remember, this is the CZ108, so it's kind of quite sticky. There we are. As I said, I'd drilled the pilot hole a bit big. Probably could have done to being 0.2 of a millimeter smaller. There you are. As I said, I'm not going to deburr because I want the thread to be as long as possible in order to be as strong as reasonably possible. So what we need to do now is to soft solder this bit onto this bit. And the kind of logic behind this kind of repair was really to maintain as much existing material as reasonably possible and to make it as reversible, if you like, undoable as possible. Not that anything is actually really completely reversible. So remember the 3 golden rules of soldering that we go through every week at the moment, it seems. One is that the material must be really clean. If the material isn't clean, and I'm sure it's the same for welding, for those of you that do welding, the solder won't stick and you will just end up with a mess. Question?
Yeah, what was the Dalon GS hypo cement for?
It was for gluing in this clock glass, which is still a little bit wobbly in the frame. But I also used it during the week for its actual proper job, like a distraction, which was gluing in a watch glass. So why did we mention it last week, you mean? Oh yeah, it was for gluing in this clock glass, but it doesn't actually need gluing in. So used it, this is a watch I've been working on, to glue in this glass that was ever so fractionally loose inside the case. So that's what it's actually used for. And it was just a top tip. I think somebody has said, what happens if the glass is loose or something? That's what it's for, gluing in the glass. It's really cool stuff, actually. It's good product. So, just using a bit of 4/0 steel wool here to really clean off that surface. Don't want to touch it. Let's get our spirit lamp. Been through this many strokes several times. I'm sure you actually know how to do this now much better than I do.
Can you use it to fix glass cracks?
No. No, for fixing glass cracks, you want an epoxy resin called Hextal, HXTAL, which is a very thin epoxy with refractive index that's not dissimilar from that of glass, so it's kind of invisible. Using the term very loosely. Just put a bit of flux on here. In fact, get a brush. Yeah, Hextal works really well. It's quite expensive, but a little goes a long way. Again, if you know a ceramics conservator, then they'll be able to help you out with that. Speaking of other conservators, remember that on Monday, we've got an Icon Institute Conservation event. They're like this, free to attend, open to all. And we've got a curator from the Royal Observatory Greenwich, Dr. Emily Ackermans. We've got a metals conservator, and we've got a books conservator, all talking about dynamic objects. So if that kind of thing is of interest, and it must have been hot when I put it on. Shrunk on there. There we are. Then please join us. Again, it will be recorded, but join us at 6 o'clock on Monday, British summertime. Okay, somewhere I've got a bit of wire for my soldering.
Mark, I think he's talking about that clock. The metric system was introduced in 1795. This clock is from later, most likely.
Oh yeah, definitely. But the metric system was introduced then, but it's when we get standardization between sort of interchangeability of threads. And certainly the people that make these screw plates, Martin, on the continent, had a very kind of standardized system. I totally agree. However, you can't go to a modern thread standard and say put in M3 or M4 and it be a match. You'll end up changing the thread, which is a bit of a no-no as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Did I? Right, okay. It's gonna be one of those days. Did put it back. Okay, so we're just going to warm this with our spirit lamp, which is all we need for soft soldering. You've seen before, sometimes I cut a piece. In this case, I think we're going to be okay. We'll just warm the whole thing up slowly. Ooh. There we are. Get a bit of wire with a bit of flux on the end and spread it out before it gets too hot. Ta-da! There we go. How nice is that? Perfect, if I do say so myself. So obviously we're going to stick, I'll put my light to work, I can't find it this time. We're going to stick this to the other piece of metal. So in order to that, we'll need to clean this new bit of metal. So there's a bit of a compromise there. We could actually use an adhesive. I'd be kind of interested in exploring that, but a bit hot. So let's just pop our, zoom in if we can. Pop our end of our strap on there to get an idea of how long it would be. The bit of metal broke off right on the corner of the knuckle. So just weeny little mark there. Bit more steel wool.
About the threads.
Yeah.
If it's a French clock, how could they use Whitworth threads? Shouldn't they use metric?
They can't have used Whitworth thread. It just happens to be the same pitch and about the right diameter. It's purely coincidence. Okay. They didn't use Whitworth thread. It's purely coincidental. But that's the thing with matching old threads, that you've just got to have a big armory of options. Ideally, everybody's got a nice big, whoops, can't see what I'm doing, industrial lathe in the corner with a infinitely variable lead screw, so you can make any thread on the planet. But regrettably, we don't all have that. So yeah, screw plates. If you follow on the Facebook group, you'll see we've got another screw plate this week, which I will talk about later if we get time. That's a BA screw plate, but no, they can't have used, they wouldn't have used the Whitworth thread, purely coincidence. Remember, as far as we're concerned, most of the threads that we come across, we're only interested in the pitch and the major diameter. Everything else can be squidged. So if there's a kind of discrepancy between the actual profile of the thread, for instance, or the flank angle of the thread, we're not going to get too excited about that, because typically you can make the thing totally strong enough.
So it depends how old the clock is. It could be Surrey or BA.
Yeah, it's likely to be Surrey type device, but the thing about those French clocks is that they seem to be kind of, you know, similar but different, if that makes sense. So exactly the same process here. It would be really nice to do some, it'd be nice to do some work on threads. So if anybody feels has got time for a research project, then don't hold back. So we're just going to tin this side as well, exactly the same as we did on the other side. Now, this is going to cause some discoloration. There was ideas about using silver solder on this, which of course would be strong, but then it would anneal the material. There we are. So it's really worth, if you haven't done much soldering, it's really worth getting some bits of brass and just getting your spirit lamp. Don't use gas because it'll get too hot too quickly and everything will go black. And just practice tinning and joining bits of brass. Then it's done. Again, I always complain about my early years in horology, and I couldn't get anybody to show me this stuff, which is why I'm here today. And I just ended up with bits of metal that would never stick together, and it was super frustrating. So just practice. And the same for silver soldering as well. In fact, the same for everything. Just practice on some bits of scrap. So I'm going to cut up some little bits of binding wire. Could just hold this together probably. If I had some of those nice soldering tweezers with insulated handles that you can buy, then I could just hold them together, but I don't. So we're just going to pop that on there. We'll get in the thing so you can see what's going on. And as we know, both sides are tinned. So in theory, I don't really want to get flux everywhere. You can just hold that together. In my Yorkshire way, I cut those bits of binding wire too short. Anyway. So with this stuff, remember, flux is corrosive. That's kind of how it works. So everything needs washing in warm, soapy water afterwards to get the flux off.
Derek's talking about the threads.
Yeah.
Those two threads being very, both based on metric measurements and very close.
Yes. Yeah, totally agree. Although BA, which is British Association, was based on a continental standard. Remember, the development of those threads was about the time that we didn't adopt the metric system. For those of you that know a bit of clock history, there was an international symposium, I think it was in Washington in the States, to agree on a prime meridian for the world. And of course, everybody wanted the prime meridian to run through their own country, particularly the French. They wanted to run through Paris, which is totally sort of understandable. So everybody got together because there's no reason for the prime meridian to run through Greenwich. It just happens to be that at that time, the vast majority of the world's shipping was based on Greenwich. So there was a deal done, a really cool deal, where this international conference agreed to make Greenwich the center of, you know, the world's navigation, which was great. And the deal was that we, as in the British, would adopt metric measurements. So we'd get some kind of international system there. And of course, the great thing was, as soon as the deal was signed, we got the prime meridian and then basically totally forgot about the metric thing. So nothing changes in politics, eh? So there we are, really rather quickly wired it together. So all I need to do now, that gives me just that little opportunity to move things around.
1884?
1884, that's right. Yeah, it's in that really great book by Derek Howes called Greenwich Time and the Meridian. And I think there was also a book by Ian Bartkey called Telling the True Time, probably in there as well, two really good books. So I'm just using my solder here to check temperature. I don't want to get it too hot or hotter than necessary. I know that once my solder melts here, I'm There we are. I'm good to go. Cool. So off camera, out, pop. Weirdly, it wouldn't be on Clock Club, would it, if I didn't injure myself? So off camera, I'm going to take this binding wire off once it's cooled down and wash everything in hot soapy water to get all the flux off. Once that's done, clean up the bezel, put the glass back in, and then, as I said, if necessary, we can use that glue to glue the glass back in. I am actually just going to go and wash my hands because I've got flux on them, and I'm going to be talking about the Fusey clock in a minute. So just bear with us while we 2-minute comfort break if you need one. Yeah. So as we segue flawlessly into Fusey clocks, we're going to use taps and dies as our segue. For no other reason than just to introduce those of you that haven't been here in the past to screw plates. So this is a screw plate and incredibly useful bit of kit. And these are basically taps here. And as you can see, this one is BA, but a Swiss-made version of BA. And weirdly, they're numbered incorrectly. So 1 BA here, put it that way around so you can see it, is actually 2 BA in this set. So in the kind of standard tap and die set. But while we're talking about BA, a really interesting story, something on my keyboard, tap and die set on my keyboard. Oh, well. And then just here's something else, because I know we like a bit of tool time, is another BA set, which is incredibly useful because, again, in horology, typically all we're interested in is pitch and major diameter, or pitch and minor diameter, it doesn't matter which. So if you find a thread that you want to match that happens to be the same pitch as BA, you can use something like this kind of die holder at a much larger diameter than the thread was actually designed for. It doesn't kind of have a consciousness about that. So my message there is in repairing older clocks, so anything that's whoops, hitting my microphone, scored by error, anything pre-1850, is that screw plates can be incredibly useful because they give you a whole lot of flexibility. Right.
Antique to tap and die set.
Yeah, I think it's probably 20th century. I mean, it's I guess they were probably using that style of split die up to the middle of the 20th century. I don't think it's that old, but it's obviously BA, so it's post 1880. Said. Okay, change of direction. So I think it was Devashish asked about Fusey clock springs. And so I thought, right, well, we're maybe not going to talk about Fusey clock springs today, because we've got to talk about Fusey clocks first. And I think on every single open clock club so far, we've basically talked about Smith's Enfield clocks and French clocks, because Smith's Enfield clocks and that type of thing are a really good place to begin. However, one of the most popular questions we get is, what do I do next? I've done a single train clock, I've done a 2-train sort of mid-20th century mantle clock. And one answer to that, as we talked about last week or the week before, is French clocks, because they're, at least in the UK, readily available and relatively inexpensive. But I know that Jane's there today, but she pretty early on in her clockmaking sort of development got a Fusey clock. And so I thought, let's look at Fusey clocks, and we'll get the mainspring out at some point, maybe today, but let's see how we get on. So bearing in mind that these sessions are primarily for beginners, a Fusey clock. So this is a timepiece clock. It's got a single train. So like every other, like Smith-Enfield that we talk about a lot, it's got a motive force, which is a mainspring. And the mainspring is in this barrel here. In fact, you can just see the edge of the leaf of the spring there through the barrel cap cutout. So that's how you get the barrel cap off when it's apart, not by whacking it on the bench and breaking the barrel apart, he says. So the mainspring, unlike our Smith-Enfield clock, which is the mainspring barrel, is integral. Usually got one kicking about, maybe not, which is integral with the great wheel, so the first wheel in the gear train. Here, the great wheel, which is underneath here, this is the first gear wheel in the train, is actually separate from the barrel, and it's connected, in this case, by this steel wire rope. Get my camera right there, I can see it better there. So you can see the barrel and the Fusey cone are connected by this steel wire rope. Now, first point I would say is, don't use steel wire rope on Fusey clocks unless you absolutely know that was intended by the manufacturer, or the phosphor bronze ones as well. Use a good quality natural gut line. Now, some of you may be asking, well, I've got a Fusey clock, or seen a Fusey clock that's got a chain instead of a line. We'll talk about those next week or the week after. We've got a chain driven clock coming. And the way you can tell whether your clock was meant to have a chain or whether it was meant to have a line is partly here in the barrel. If it was meant to have a line, it'll have 3 holes in it like this, and we'll talk about that later. But also you can tell by the section of the Fusey here, and I think this one. All right, yeah, it is. So the section of the helix of the Fusey, maybe not helix, but anyway, is semicircular in this case, indicating that this clock was always intended to have a line. If the clock was intended to have a chain, that section will be kind of channel or U-shaped with square corners to fit the chain. So very different kind of animals in that respect. So that's our first thing. So the barrel, the mainspring, our motive force, drives into the Fusey cone via this line, gut line, or in this case, metal wire rope. Now, oh, absolutely brilliant. You couldn't make it up. This is perfect for us. And we'll see in a bit why you don't use a wire rope. And I apologize if people do use them, but don't use them, basically, I would say. So this thing here for beginners is the device where the clock gets its name. So this is the Fusey, F-U-S-E-E. I think it was used by the Romans in those big catapults called ballistas, and Leonardo da Vinci drew one. And the point of the Fusey is to even out the torque of the mainspring as it develops or as it unwinds. So if you imagine the old clockwork toy that we all know and love from our youth, when you wind it at the beginning, it goes really fast, that crocodile swimming in the bath or the clockwork train, and then it slows down and gets slower and slower and slower. And of course, with the clock, we don't want that because of escapement error on the going train or on the striking train, because we don't want the striking to get slower and slower and slower. So there are 2 ways around this. The Continentals typically use a much longer, thinner ribbon of steel, sometimes with something called stop work. So they get around it that way. In England and to a degree on the continent, we employed this device here called the fusee. Now this clock has run down, okay, so it's completely run out. And you can see that the fusee line is pulling on the largest radius of the fusee, which makes sense. It gives the mainspring a greater mechanical advantage. As we wind the clock, and I don't want to wind it too much, I'm going to let it down in a minute. You can see it's all a bit dark inside there. Let's just go like this. As we wind the clock, you can see that the line slowly moves as you wind the thing along the fusee. So the line is pulling at a smaller and smaller and smaller radius. So the theory, at least, is that the torque output from the mainspring, if you think of that as a kind of S shape, is matched with this fusee, which brings us round to the big problem of replacing springs in fusee clocks, because the chance of you getting a matched mainspring is like pretty low, to say the least. So the first rule is don't chuck the old mainspring away, just keep it, even if it's so-called set and doesn't develop to 2.5 times the diameter of the barrel. Please try it first. So that's, we'll talk more about this when we get the thing in bits. Yes, questions? Do you know who made the clock? This, yeah. No idea. It's I bought it off the internet. It came with no dial. I can't see any maker's marks on it. It's probably early 20th century. It's got screwed pillars here at the back. Pretty standard fare. So I would say it would have been made by, I don't know, one of those Birmingham manufacturers or the London ones, and made in their tens of thousands to service the offices and schools and railway stations of the world, basically. But I no indication yet. Let's have a look. We might find a mark as we get into it. So should metal wire be replaced by catgut? Yeah, it's cow, not cat. Okay. Yeah, or a synthetic if you don't want the whole cow gut thing. Yeah, the gut, the best gut I think for a gut line comes from inside a beef cow, Sisal beef, I think it's called. And I get mine from a company called Bull Brand in Kings Lane in Norfolk here. And it's quite expensive relatively compared to getting it from a clock dealer, but it's really high quality. It costs about £20 a length, something like that. But on an overhaul of a clock, that's a relatively small proportion of the whole. Yeah, and I'll show you why. I sound like I'm on my soapbox, but I'm not making it up. Why wire rope just isn't suitable for a fusee clock.
Jane said hers has got a chain on it and it's got a mind of its own.
Great. Jane's clock's got a chain on it. We'll come round to, it was really brave of Jane to tackle this clock. So it's like a whopping great big dial clock. The mainspring must have been a real animal. So just before we move on, just want to draw your attention to this device here. So you can answer this because I've done a lot of talking already. What is this device? What is it called? And what's it for? So in the live chat, please, what's that device and what is it for? So like a regular clock, once we get past the fusee, don't be intimidated by this thing because it's just bog standard clock. It's got a center wheel here. It's got an upper intermediate wheel. Some people call it the third wheel, whatever. It's got an escape wheel. And then this one has got a pretty bog standard pair of anchor recoil pallets. So nothing we haven't seen in our Smith's Enfield clock. Yeah, the pallets here are solid metal, not the bent strip type, but basically they are the same thing.
Jeremy says fusee stop arm to stop it overwinding up the end.
Fusee stop arm. Yeah, that's what it is. It's stop work that prevents you using the ends of the spring. So if we imagine, run out of paper as well. Stop iron. If we imagine the torque output from the spring, let's say it's something like that, and we've got 8 days or with duration, what you want to do is to use this bit of the torque curve, which is a relatively sort of flat bit, which actually, if it's inverted like that, looks kind of like the fusee cone. And so we get rid of this bit and this bit by preloading the spring and by using that fusee stop iron that we've just seen. But we'll talk about that more as we get it apart. Now, this it'd be interesting to see whether this clock has got what we believe it's its original spring or not. It's actually, you can tell when you come to a fusee dial clock. If you get a fusee dial clock and you wind it and it's like easy to wind, you go, my heart leaps, because I believe, or I think that when I get the spring out, it's going to be the original spring. It's easy to wind. It's not pulling the clock apart when it's running. But maybe like the Smith Enfield clocks, these things, these office dials were really overdriven from new to make sure they kind of run, whether they're covered in spiders' webs and dust and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, much more to say on fusee clocks. Let's start getting the motion work off, and then we'll talk about this device here. As you saw when I came, this clock had 2 winding keys on it, rather confusingly. But anyway, so motion work, a couple of things to talk about here.
Can you just show that thing again?
The stop iron.
Sorry.
I can if you don't call it a stop arm. Call it what you like. I'm joking. I'm joking. So this is the fusee stop iron, IRON, and this is the fusee stop iron block, and this is the fusee stop iron spring. And if you look here on the end of the fusee, there's the fusee stop piece, and that engages with the stop iron. I don't want to wind the clock fully at the moment because I'm going to explain why in a minute, but we'll demonstrate it when we get it apart. Probably won't be this week, but
is the fusee thing supposed to do the same as different size pulleys on a lathe?
Yeah, it's like that. It's like inside a milling machine, different design, but that constant variable output. So yeah, to a degree, it's what else to describe it as. But yeah, when your spring's fully wound, there's more torque than when it's nearly completely unwound. And what that fusee does is it evens out the torque. We know from previous open clock clubs, there's a thing called escapement error, and get a screwdriver. And we know that with the anchor recoil escapement, we've got positive escapement error. So when you drive the clock more, the clock runs faster and vice versa. In weight-driven clocks, we don't see the escapement error because it's weight-driven and it gets regulated out.
So bicycle chain and gearing similar?
It's kind of, I mean, if you imagine, yeah, kind of. I mean, if you, I'm trying to think of an analogy. I mean, it's a variable gear, a constantly variable gear, absolutely. But in terms of, if you start the day on your bike and you're full of beans and you're chomping away in 5311 or something, got it in a high gear, at the end of the day, you're exhausted nearly, you move down into a lower and lower and lower gear. So it's easy to pedal, kind of. Maybe that's not a particularly good analogy. It's to even out the change in torque from mainspring. But if you want to go back to that, I'm happy to explain it more in future weeks. And yeah, so I'll just remove the minute cock. Now on our Smith Enfield clocks, we don't have this thing. The minute wheel here just sits on a post, but it's exactly the same principle. Nothing here at all complicated that you haven't seen before. Nice quality though. Interestingly, it's dot marked on the back. And anything else there to say? I just wondered then whether it had some teeth let in, but it doesn't. Yeah, so it's dot marked on the back, which is kind of interesting because I'm not quite sure why that is. Maybe it's to do with the fact that the hour hand, as you can see, is screwed, like was, the clock doesn't have any hands, unfortunately, was screwed to the hour pipe, which is absolutely typical for these clocks. So if you want the relationship between the minute hand and the hour hand to be correct, which obviously you do, you can't, like a mantle clock, like our Smith's Enfield, you just shove the hour hand around because it fits on a pipe. You don't have that luxury here. If you start yanking the hour hand round, it's going to break the teeth off. So that's probably what the dot marks are for. Sometimes on posher clocks, this wheel, the hour wheel, isn't permanently fixed to the hour wheel pipe. There's a slip washer on the back, and you can move the two in relation to each other. See the dot mark there, put on by the maker. And then we've got underneath here our cannon wheel with a square for the minute hand, and I think that'll be marked. All a little bit grubby. Yes, it is, yeah. So there's, you can see a notch there, look, on the square. So that notch relates to that dot, which relates to that dot, like that, which relates to the dot on the back of the hour wheel. So you can put the whole thing together in the hands when it's like 3 or 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, in fact, are either aligned or at 90 degrees. One thing to say here is that this animal, the boat, B-O-A-T or B-O-W, which depending on which name you like, or friction spring, is often replaced, and it's often replaced so-called wrong. This spring, in order to work properly, should be both tapered in thickness and in width as well. Because what happens, and I think this is the case, if you make it out of uniform material, it tends to bend down in the middle here, and the wings touch the plate. So if we just get it so you can see, it's just about see inside there. When we put our cannon wheel in friction, yeah, look, the friction spring touches the front plate. It's a little bit difficult to see in there. That's quite a lot difficult to see in there. But so that's something to look out for, and we can just have a look on the front plate, and doesn't actually look like it's been running. But if you get the situation, been rubbing, sorry, if you get the situation where that spring is broken, then make the new spring so it tapers both in thickness and in width as well, and it'll bend nice and evenly along its length, and it won't touch the front plate. So we've got to at some point make some hands for this clock, which will be great, good fun. So that's our motion work. How are we doing for time? We've got 12 minutes, good. So
the first fusee he's seen using steel wire, are they rare?
No, it's not. It's just that somebody in the middle of the 20th century, like all those other, who were those people, decided that, and I totally get it, without going off onto a massive rant or anything, as always. I think what happened in the 1920s, 1930s, this kind of clock, you know, Mainz Electric came along, not so much demand. And what happened with the trade of horology is presumably lots of people either died off or, you know, retired or something. And very broadly, that interest in horology was a vacuum that got filled by lots of skilled people. And a wire rope, of course, if you look at a crane on a construction site, is a really great idea. But any engineer will tell you that a wire rope mustn't run round a pulley that's less than 20 times the radius of the wire. Otherwise, it gets work hardened and fractured. And that's the situation that we've got here. So this is not a crane on a construction site. I don't know anything about engineering. So total respect there. So I can see why logic says a wire rope is a good thing, but it's not a good thing on a fusee clock. I'll show you why when we get the clock apart. So the question before we get to the mainspring is always the first thing we say to beginners when you get your Smith's Enfield mantle clock. We wrote a nice book about it up there, by the way. If I didn't mention it already 10 times today, is you've got to let the power off the mainspring before you take the frame apart. So if you undo these fixings here, all the energy that's stored in the barrel, if the clock is wound up, is going to be released instantaneously, and at least you're probably going to damage part of the clock, but you also might damage yourself, personal injury and damage to property. So you've got to let the power off the mainspring. So normally what we do is we, I really wish I had an actual proper normal clock to look at. Crazy, isn't it? When you want one, you can't find one, there's hundreds. Normally what we do is we let down the power from the ratchet, the mainspring ratchet that holds all the power back or energy back in a safe manner using safety gloves, goggles, and a mainspring letdown tool. There's a video about it on our YouTube channel. But wait a minute, Matthew, you're saying, how do you let down the power on a Fusey clock? I don't want to wind it too much, but let's just wind it a little bit. Because where on earth is the winding ratchet? Well, when we look at when we wind it, the great wheel's staying still and the Fusey cone is rotating, and the winding ratchet is hidden inside here, so you can't get to it. So you can't use a mainspring letdown tool here and let it down because you can't access the ratchet. But sometimes you can, because there's some clever manufacturer. If you've got Fusey clocks, I'm sure you know about this, but just in case you don't, you will see there's a tiny little hole drilled between two great wheel teeth, where using a mainspring letdown tool here, you can put a bit of blued steel wire in, and that touches on the tail of the ratchet, and you can safely let down the power. Now, the problem is if you put a bit of wire in there and don't have a letdown tool on it, same thing will happen, there'll be some explosion. So you may be saying, well, wait a minute, Matthew, what is this device for then if that's not to let down the power? You could do it this way. It's not particularly neat doing that way because this isn't a winding ratchet, as you've seen. This, once the clock's assembled, this thing doesn't move. So I could ask you a question, but we're going to run out of time anyway. Is what on earth is this for? This is for setting up the preload on the mainspring. Remember our amazing drawing before? So we've got stop work at the top, but we've got preload at the bottom. And so that is what this device is for here. You set that up when you first assemble a clock and you never touch it again. So the reality is, and this is why it's always best to let the clock run down, is that the only there isn't a neat way of doing this or a realistic way of doing this, is to let the train run through. Now, I would normally say, don't let the train run through. It's not nice, everything grinding away, especially when the clock is dirty like this is. But I kind of can't, well, there isn't another way around it. So what I'm going to do is, before I let the clock down, is I'm just going to put a bit of thin oil. I'm actually going to use turpentine spirit here on the bearings, just to lubricate them a bit. Doesn't matter how scruffy this is. I've actually already done this, but I'll just do it a little bit more. And all I can do here, because I've looked and I can't see a hole drilled between any of the great wheel teeth. So all I can do is to take the pallets out and carefully let the train unwind. And you've got to be a bit careful because often these lines are frayed. Somewhere here, I thought I'd seen a screw that has got burrs on it. I wanted to look at that. So we'll take our back cock off and let's just have a, so we've got a cast metal back cock, absolutely typical Fusey shape thing with steady pins. Nothing unusual about that. Sometimes there's two notches in the top for if the wall isn't level. In this case, it's just one for the suspension spring. So totally standard, and standard arrangement for Fusey pallets. If you haven't seen these before, both the pallet frame and the crutch, I'll just put that in there for stop it from running down. Better word. I'm going to show you this because often on Fusey pallets you find that this screw hole here has gotten kind of a bit worn or something, and if that screw isn't a good fit, then what you find is that the pallets are operating and there's a little bit of loss as it gets transferred to the pendulum through the crutch. So make sure that these screws are both good and tight. But yeah, pallets and crutch screwed onto the collets, absolutely typical. Looks like it's cracked there, which it is, but it's not affecting the kind of stability of the piece. In terms of pallets, got a bit of wear on the entry pallet and a bit of wear on the exit pallet. Don't polish out their pallets, they're fine, I think. So let's just let this run through. I'm kind of going to keep it a bit controlled, which is why I didn't want to wind it too much. And the reason I'm not letting down that preload thing, you could do it that way, is I want to see how much this spring is preloaded. Now, who knows whether that's ideal for this clock. No, you could let it down here, but I want to see how much preload there is. So there are different things, and you'll see as you could let it down here, but we'll never know how much preload there is. And it's also not that neat. You could do it that way, but in this case, I would prefer to have the clock run down. Now, total word of warning, listen up everybody if you've never worked on a Fusey clock before. We've let the power off the spring lock. The train is free, but so you might think, great, I can take the frame apart. No, you can't, because the spring inside here is pre-loaded. That spring's still under tension. If you take the frame apart now, there'll still be, admittedly not a massive explosion, but a mini explosion. This screw here, you can see, is Bird. This is the one I was talking about. Sometimes on these Fusey setup clicks, there's a spring on the click, but on a like 17th century clocks, but on 18th, 19th century clocks, it tends not to be. So when I'm going to put my safety glove on. When you let down the power, so this spring is pre-loaded, and it's useful, although, you know, take that information with a pinch of salt. It's useful to know how much it's preloaded. Don't build your practice on rules of thumb. However, ... being the hypocrite that I am, the rule of thumb, if you don't have any preload or you fit the new spring, is kind of 1 turn of the barrel arbor, but that's, yeah, take that with a pinch of salt. So we undo the screw for the click a tiny bit. Again, don't take the screw out because it'll be a mini explosion. And then we're going to use a key on here, good, reasonably good fit. And let's get our, actually can't really do that, bit of pegwood. And we're going to see how much preload there is. So I'm going to lift up the click and let it down 1 tooth at a time. So 1, 2, 3, reposition my key so I'm comfortable. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Spring's quite dry in here, you probably just heard it. So it was about 13, lost count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So yeah, as predicted, basically 1 turn of that, that ratchet. But remember, this isn't the winding ratchet. This is only used for preload when you put the clock together. So
when winding the fusee, if it slips, is it the click or the click spring issue inside the fusee?
If it
slips.
But if you're winding it, often you hear the spring kind of readjusting itself, and that's often to do with the fact that it's a later spring with a very kind of refined surface. But if it slips back, then yeah, it's nothing to do with this. It's to do with the winding ratchet that's inside here. And you'll see when we get it apart next week that that winding ratchet is kind of remarkably small. It's incredible how it takes the force. So now we just double, triple check that all the power is off here. Okay, so it's completely loose now. There's no power on that spring. So we can now safely, I think we've run out of time, haven't we? Yeah, we can safely take this apart. Just want to do one thing, get back on my conservation soapbox. This is my favorite place to be. And that's with screws like this, tool avalanche, that are a bit burred. You can see the burrs on this. Please don't file the burrs off. Just not necessary, just changes the nature of the screw. Please don't put them in the lathe and start filing or polishing or even worse, bluing them, in my view. Not that I was ever opinionated or anything, but just get good old split stake, put that badger in there, get a little hammer, and just very gently tap those burrs back into place, maybe a little bit more there. If you want, you might leave the burrs there, but please don't file them off. In my view, it's just unnecessary making your clock. Anyway, so as warned you, it's going to be full on this evening. I think we've covered a heck of a lot of ground as always. Next week, we'll progress with the fusee clock and we'll have a chain fusee maybe as well. That isn't going to happen next week, but I want to talk about the mainspring in this clock and about the incredible difficulty of replacing mainsprings. And I know many of you are asking, you're members of other Facebook groups and fora and institutions. So I'm asking you a big favor here, is that if people are replacing mainsprings just like, what's the word? Replacing them without any kind of, not thinking, because that's unfair, but any kind of sort of analysis or questioning of it, because of this golden rule of 2.5 to 3 times development of the mainspring barrel size, then I would love it if you stuck your neck out and said, wait a minute, why are you doing that? Because it causes a lot of damage to clocks by replacing springs with modern ones that are too strong, overdriven. You will be amazed when we get this clock running, how little energy it takes to run it. It's got no striking work or anything. Anyway, bit of a rant there, I'm afraid, but there you go. You don't get out for now, as we say in Yorkshire. So massive thank you to Team Open Clock Club for typing away in the corner. And brilliant to see you all. It's I think the Facebook thing and the live stream are really brilliant at the moment. Please join us on Monday for our ICON Institute of Conservation lecture. It's free. Thursday for the live stream. If not, hopefully see you on Facebook in the meantime, or maybe next Saturday when we'll progress with this project. So as always, your support is really appreciated. Thanks and have a great weekend. Bye for now.